Hello y hola a todos. Me llamo Erik Swinson. My name is Erik Swinson, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to paint a red dragon using the new color collection from Vallejo Acrylics. En este video te enseño a pintar un dragón rojo utilizando la colección nueva de Vallejo. Por favor, disculpa mi pronunciación, porque todavía estoy aprendiendo español y espero poder doblar mis videos para ti en el futuro. Ahora, vamos. Let's paint. Here I'm just beginning with a black prime model. I've left the wings off for ease of painting, but we'll get to those later in the video series. I'm starting with the game color Night Blue as an initial base coat using the airbrush. It has a nice cool color tone, and as we build up the additional reds on top of it, it will turn to a more violet and increase in saturation as we go up. So here I'm just spraying it from above, and from the sides, and as we work towards the next color, as I've added here, I've done a mix of scarlet red and night blue in about 50-50, and I'm spraying a little more from above than the previous layer. Now I'm working at about, 45-degree angle from above, and leaving a lot of that dark blue and black shadow underneath. All right, now here I'm spraying a 100% scarlet red, now focusing on specific rounded volumes. As I paint more of this model, you'll see that I am more focused on the front of the model. I'm trying to draw attention towards the chest and the face, but here I am applying it pretty much everywhere, in smaller areas from above, but mostly focusing towards the front of the model. Okay, and in this step I have added hot orange to the scarlet red. This is all game color so far. The hot orange is going to go in even smaller areas. One of the things to know about this color, though, is that straight through the airbrush, it is not going to be hyper saturated. It's not going to have super high coverage. So this is all just an initial phase in order to get us to a point where we can start working with the brush. Okay, in this step I have now spraying pure, I'm now spraying some orange fire through the airbrush, and I'm just hitting areas like on the tops of the arms, the shoulders, the top of the head, and a little bit on the tail. As you can see that this is not very orange. The coverage over top of a dark color is not going to be super intense. Alright, so I've now switched to using a large brush, and with a mixture of the scarlet red and hot orange, I'm beginning to sketch out even more light on the upper parts of the volumes, but also focusing towards the front of the model. You'll notice as we work through the process that a lot more of the light is focused towards what I would consider the front view of the model, where the head is turned, and a lot less light is put onto the back of the model. The red, you can also see, is much more intense at this point, even though we're using a darker color than what we had gotten to on the airbrush. The opacity of the color is much stronger with painting it with the brush than it is through the airbrush. As I move to my next layer of sketching, again, I'm not focused here on blending or anything like that. As I move into more light, I'll slowly refine the highlighting process. At this point, I'm just trying to place my lights where I think they should go and begin to, render the volumes of the muscles in a way that is interesting. But as I move up in light, I'm going to focus more light towards the face. So each mixture I do, I'm adding more of the hot orange. You can see on the palette, the bottom left of the palette is the scarlet red, the top left is the hot orange, and the top right is the orange fire, which we have not moved to yet. Okay, so here I've grabbed Vallejo Model Color US Olive Drab, and for the underbelly of the dragon, I want it to be white. The reason I'm not using a gray is I want to keep warm colors throughout, so I've decided to go with a very desaturated green, which contrasts well against red, and I'm just using a very large flat brush to sketch in where that transition from the red skin to the white underbelly will be. The one I want to talk about briefly about the reason I do sketching is because at this stage, they're still very early in the model. If I place the color somewhere where I decide that I don't like them, it is easy enough to change. So here I've grabbed some of the night blue and I've mixed it with the US Olive Drab. It's created an even more darker, desaturated green blue, and I'm using for the deepest shadows of the white. The reason I'm using the blue is because it's transitioning more towards a cold color, and it is the same blue that we use to make the dark kind of violet of the red skin. A lot of the paint at this point is very wet when you're doing large surfaces like this and using a very large brush, so I'm able to wet blend some areas. Even though I'm not super focused on blending, while it's wet, I'm able to quickly create some preliminary blends. Okay, so here I've added some English uniform to my palette. I'm going to begin highlighting the white underbelly with that, mixing it with a bit of my olive drab. The English uniform is it has a bit of yellow in it, but it is still kind of a khaki sort of color. It just helps add even more warmth to the light areas of the white, what will eventually be a very white looking flesh. So here I've grabbed some of the red and I'm going to just clean up a bit of the area, get a solid line between the white underbelly and the red skin. Alright, so on my palette I have added light green gray to my mixture, mixing it with a lot of the English uniform and increasing the light on the white underbelly again. As I add more and more of that light green gray, it'll get closer to appearing like a white. The something I want to talk about with white real quick is that a white does not have to be purely a neutral gray to white. You can have slight off whites, but still achieve that feeling of a white color tone based off of the amount of light you have. So even though I will never use a pure white for the underbelly, the very light nature of it next to the red will make it appear to be a white-ish skin. Alright, so on my palette I have added some elf skin tone from game color range, and I've mixed it with a bit of the orange fire. And now I've grabbed a smaller brush than before. It's still relatively large, but I'm now adding brush strokes to the skin in a very textured kind of brush strokes along the horizontal line of the skin. You can see on the model it has a very wrinkly sort of texture to it, so we're going to enhance that with the brush strokes. And I am increasing the light again within the highlights that I've already done to further enhance the light on the front of the model and on the chest. Here I'm adding a lot to the face and on the neck. Using even more of the elf skin tone in the mixture, I continue the process of highlighting these areas. I want this skin to feel almost shiny feeling. Can over enhance it, over exaggerate the highlights at this point and then always pull it back, which you will see later. But still mostly focusing on the shoulder and the front of the arm. I'm using less and less highlights towards the lower part of the forearm, towards the hand. Most of it's on the shoulder muscles, on what I guess would be his back muscles. And I'm gonna, in some of these areas that I now feel are kind of dark, I've gone back to one of my previous mixtures. The nice thing about using a wet palette and creating your blends is that you can always go back to one of your colors that you've mixed before. So it makes it a very easy process of, a kind of tug of war where you're moving back and forth from your darkest colors. It's a very makes it a very non-linear process and easy to make changes while still sketching. So as you can see, I'm not highlighting from above the model, right? I'm not highlighting the tops of the muscles, or the tops of the volumes. I'm highlighting more towards the front. A lot of times I would say at a 45-degree angle to the volume, right? So if you imagine a sphere, we wouldn't highlight the very top of it or the very front of it. We'd highlight more just above the horizon line. It's a more illustrative look to it, but it gives, I think, the model more visual impact. So here I'm continuing to highlight the face, adding more and more of the elf skin tone to my mixture. Areas that I feel are too black at this point in the light areas, I add the red and continue to move back and forth with the different mixtures on my palette. So start to highlight the lower jaw, the snout, the eyebrows. Here I decide that the back leg needs a bit more light on it. It won't go as far as the front arm, but it was the transition from the amount of light on the front arm to the back leg was too harsh of a transition, so can add more light where it's needed. Here, just keep pushing the light. It's gonna look, the elf skin tone is pretty light. It's not as light of a value as, say, like ivory or white, but it is a pretty bright color. And so some details on the face. Now I'm working smaller and smaller as I move up in value. So as I add more light to the model, I highlight smaller and more refined. Okay. So in this step, I have taken some of the scarlet blood in the light green gray. The light green gray is going to lighten the quite cold scarlet or scarlet red, and it is can begin to highlight a bit of the back of the model just to add form to it, so it's not entirely in dark. It's going to make it more of like a wine red instead of like a super warm orangish red. So again, just now I'm continuing to refine my sketching stage. I want to create a bit of more volume to some of the muscles, add a bit of shadows. This is more of that was more of a glaze at that point. I'll continue to do some more glaze to reintroduce color and saturation where the elf skin tone has gotten too bright and killed the red. The red is a very interesting color where if you highlight it too much, it can start to feel pink. And later in this process, you will see that I will try and restore a lot of that red feeling as the skin tone starts to become sort of washed out feeling. Right now you can already see that it has become a bit washed out with all of the kind of light orange and skin tone colors. Here I'm using pretty much almost the light green gray to add some shape and highlights to the underbelly, the odd rib cage that is on this model, and a bit of underneath the neck. Also started to create a bit of the unusual texture where the red skin transitions to the white skin. They're like a kind of zigzag pattern of brushstrokes that it is not like just a clean line that separates the two. A clean line would make it feel very inorganic, and the more kind of jaggedy line that goes into the folds creates a more natural feeling to it. this point, you can see that I'm painting much slower and trying to be a bit more refined. I would say this is now moving past the sketching stage into a more refinement stage, and I'm going to be much more controlled and slower with my brush strokes. Trying to be very intentional with where I place them. Okay, so adding even more light at this point, it's like the highlight regions of the pure elf skin tone is very small. Now highlighting some of the wrinkles to get that very stripy, natural feeling to the skin. Don't want it to look very smooth. There's a lot of texture, and we're going to enhance that texture. Right, so I've added some of the night blue to my scarlet red and just sketching in some blending in between previous sketched cold highlights on the back of the model. Continue to work with intermediate tones. Again, very easy because I have all of my mixtures on my wet palette. I can find an intermediate tone and work back and forth and begin to blend out some of these areas. Adding more of the light green gray to create that now kind of pinkish color to the backside of the model. I like to use a little bit of green again because it desaturates the color without making it extremely pink looking. It's more almost of like a rose color. And you can see that I've moved back and forth a lot. I'm not just finishing all of the red skin at one point and then moving to the white skin. I try and advance the still what is very sketchy all at the same time. By advancing the whole model at the same time, it's much easier to find the areas that need more work, as opposed to hyper refining one area of the model at once and then finding that something's not working in that area and you've spent a ton of time on it, and now you have to go back and change that because it's not working with the rest of the model. By sketching each stage and working all over the model, I'm able to analyze the model as a whole. Here I've decided that I need a bit more highlighting on the back leg. I guess I felt I went too far there, so now using a glaze, which is just a very watered down mixture. It's not going to have super strong coverage. I can start to restore some of that color back into the skin where the some of it got lost because of over highlighting. And you can see on the palette that kind of large pool right in the center of the palette, how watered down that mixture is. It's going to let a lot of that previous work show through. And basically, if you don't know what a glaze is yet, a glaze is essentially like a wash, but we don't want it to flood the model everywhere. We're trying to control where the glaze goes so that we can just place it where we want, whereas a wash, it's extremely loaded and flows into the recesses. That is not what we want with a glaze. So after the glaze, I'm now just, again, going back, refining even more, reintroducing some highlights that got toned down a little too much, increasing the texture, starting to highlight things like veins, some of the more small details of the model. If you can call the details on this model small, this model is very large. Here, creating a bit more of the neutral color, trying to enhance the shadow a little bit under the shoulder muscle, and I guess what would be the deltoid and the tricep, around the neck, trying to enhance that definition between those two muscle groups. Again, applying some more glazing to the face. Bit more highlights. You're going to end up finding that the level of highlights are extremely bright in a few certain points of interest. Okay, started to be a bit more refined on some of the ribs. The area around the chest is got a lot of small details that will continue to get refined. The neck has an interesting, very striped texture to it. Okay, so super detailed in here. Here I'm trying something out by doing little spotted patterning where the skin sort of breaks up into each other, right? So some of the white starts to split and creates little spots as the two blend into each other. A lot of that'll end up going away, but I think it's worth showing you the things that also don't work on the model, right? So I'm not perfect. I will experiment, try something. If I find it doesn't work, it's easy enough to paint over and just cover right over top of it. So here, doing some red dots. Decide pretty much immediately that I don't like them, wipe them off. All right, and here, if yep, nope, dots aren't working for me. They go away. Some of these smaller dots, I think I liked, and I ended up connecting them. Here I'm using a very much smaller brush, trying to be extremely refined with the lines, adding even more texture, and using the elf skin tone, which is close in value to the light green gray. I can begin to merge the two into each other. So overlapping texture following the shape of the sculpted wrinkles in the skin. I can invent some of my own, join them, connect them anywhere where I find it interesting to create even more of that, push that texture even further. So using some of the bit more of the orange in some of the darker areas. I don't want every highlight to be, or every highlight of each wrinkle to be the exact same level of value. So I can lower the level of highlights in the shadow areas for the wrinkles. We also create an interesting contrast here by doing all of these wrinkles more towards the focus area of the model. By having a high detail contrast, we can create another sort of interest by having more detail in the areas of light and less details in the area of shadow, where on the back portions of the model where I don't want as much interest, I won't enhance this texture as much. So now using some of the scarlet red, I will push some of these, redefine some of the shadows of the wrinkles. And it's almost like edge highlighting or painting cracks, you know, on them. If you've ever painted scratches or cracks on a model where you place an edge highlight right next to a black line to create a scratch that is freehand scratch that isn't there. It's a very similar concept. Here I'm glazing a little bit of the blue back into the deepest areas of shadow to define the muscles even more. Now I'm glazing a little bit of the orange in. See, it starts to restore some of the color. The wrinkles got very bright. I want a bit more of that orange feeling. So using a glaze, easy enough to bring the color back in. The orange is orange fire is a very translucent color, so it will not completely cover the work we've done, especially in a glaze form. Restoring just a little bit of the light in just the brightest areas that I want. So I have trying to exaggerate that volume of his musculature even further. All of this could be a very similar process if you were painting a figure with scales instead of, wrinkly skin. Instead, we could have certain scales with much brighter highlights and create an almost iridescent effect by having certain parts of the scales be extremely bright and shiny and other parts of the scales being much darker